Welcome to the Blue Security Podcast, a weekly podcast for information security defenders, where we bring you discussions on best practices, tools, and implementation for enterprise security. Now, here are your hosts for today's show, Andy Jha and Adam Brewer.
Welcome to this week's episode of the Blue Security Podcast. I'm Andy, your host.
I'm Adam, your co-host.
So today we are going to talk about Microsoft licensing.
Woohoo!
Super exciting topic. And we're going to mainly focus on security because obviously that's our audience. So we're not going to dive into a lot of the productivity stuff, which can get very, very complicated. But the reason why we wanted to talk about this is because we had a few listeners ask about, how does Microsoft license all this stuff? It's very confusing, which it is. And oftentimes, Adam and I, we both work at Microsoft. We will talk to customers and they may not know, what do I own? What is included in my current licensing model? They have security products that they already own, and then they are looking elsewhere because they're not sure. They don't know what they own. So this is a conversation that we have all the time, and it is complicated. At Microsoft, we have dedicated people solely focused on licensing called commercial executives. And so it's so complicated that
It's literally a full-time job.
Full-time job to learn about the entitlements that people have for specific licensing. So it's kind of funny. What I wanted to do at the top here is just mention there is I think this is a MVP maintained website.
No, he's a full-time employee.
Oh, he's a full-time employee.
Aaron Dinage, he's in Australia.
Okay.
Down under.
He maintains something called Microsoft 365 Maps. You may have come across it, but it's m365maps.com. I'll put a link in the show notes, of course. But this kind of gives you a great visualization of the different products and kind of a high-level overview of what's included in each one. It's great. It shows you a visualization of each of the suites and so on and so forth. So take a look at that. And then I'll also mention that, we're going to talk about a lot of these bundles, but for the most part, many of the security things, especially like in the E3, E5 bundles, can be purchased separately. And we'll kind of mention those as we go along. But a lot of these things can be purchased separately. So the bundles are really where the savings comes in. There are some nuances. When we say E, it really means enterprise, like E3, E1, E5. It's like the enterprise licensing. There's A, so like A1, A3, A5, which is education for government. There's just G3 and G5. And then there's an F SKU as well, which is frontline. We're not going to dive too much into the frontline. There's going to be a part 2 to this security licensing. This is actually going to be a 3-part series because there's so much to talk about. But frontline workers is a whole nother thing, and that's the F SKU. There's also some older licensing that's out there. We're not going to get into that either, mainly because this is a 101 and a lot of that legacy licensing is kind of getting moved out. So what we're going to talk about today is mainly like if you were to try to buy things today from Microsoft, this is mainly what we sell and how it's structured. And so before we get into the specific solutions, there's some concepts here that Adam can talk about, which is the EA versus EAS versus MCA. And that's kind of how the legal part of the agreement is structured and how you buy it. So Adam, why don't you talk about this for our listeners here?
Yeah, and before I even get into enterprise agreements and Microsoft customer agreements for enterprise, obviously, if you figured it out, even if you're a new listener, Andy and I both work for Microsoft. However, we do the show outside of work. We self-fund the show, and we do it on our own time and, again, on our own dime. So although we, of course, work for Microsoft and we want that to be known to our listeners and viewers, we do this show without editorial input from Microsoft. It's the work of Andy and Adam, not the work of Microsoft Corporation. So just want to make that clear. And everything we say on this show is, as to the best of our knowledge, accurate, but does not act as official guidance from Microsoft and does not supersede anything that's in your agreements that you have made with Microsoft or anything you are being told from your licensing solutions provider, your LSP, or your commercial executive, as Andy mentioned. They are where the buck stops with this stuff. We're just having a conversation today and going to do our best to highlight and summarize the nuances of Microsoft licensing. So with that out of the way, Andy, you kind of teed me up here. Let's talk about enterprise agreements. And before we even do that, I want to shout out to another podcast. If you are not listening to the Acquired podcast with David Rosenthal and Ben Gilbert, stop what you're doing, go to your podcast app, and subscribe to Acquired. It is an incredible show that tells the stories of great companies. And it's so fun to listen to. You may say that doesn't sound very interesting, but they're excellent podcasters and their style is so compelling that you'll find yourself listening to a 3.5-hour show on Costco and thinking it's the most interesting thing you've ever heard. So they have done 2 parts on Microsoft, and they do really in the second part 2. They talk a lot about the genesis of the enterprise agreement. And when Microsoft pivoted from being more of a consumer-focused company, if you think of Microsoft in the early to mid 90s, it was much more consumer focused. Think of the massive launch of Windows 95, and the pivot over time into enterprise happened later, really under Steve Ballmer. And it's really Ballmer's enduring contribution to Microsoft is how strong Microsoft became in the enterprise, because that was not a given or a certain thing. And to be honest, Bill Gates was incredibly uninterested in the enterprise. So Steve Ballmer gets all of the credit for Microsoft as the enterprise company it is today. So a great listen, great historical context. We're just going to talk about the facts today, but wanted to plug that because I just got doing my second listen through of part 1 and part 2 of their Microsoft story, like 6.5 hours of podcast. And it's awesome. Even as an employee, as a fan of computer history, I learn something new every time I listen to it. Enterprise agreement is the standard way in which most enterprises buy software from Microsoft. And there's kind of 2 major flavors of it. There's the standard enterprise agreement, and then there's an enterprise agreement subscription. So an EA or an EAS. And there's some minor nuances between them. I really unpack them on this show. But what you need to know about the enterprise agreement, and this is something people get wrong a lot of times, the enterprise agreement itself is actually an evergreen agreement between Microsoft and your organization. Until one side rescinds the agreement, it's good in effectively perpetuity. There's some nuance to it, but that's how it effectively works. So when people think of an enterprise agreement and they say, well, it's a 3-year agreement, it's not the enterprise agreement. It's what's called an enrollment. So if we're going to be precise in our language, what expires after generally 3 years is your enterprise agreement enrollment. And you can have multiple enrollments over the life of an EA because an EA is evergreen. Now, an enrollment is where you're going to have all your licensing on there. 1,000 seats of Microsoft 365 E3, 1,000 seats of Microsoft 365 E5, 1,000 seats of Defender for Endpoint Plan 2. Whatever you're interested in, on-premises solution, SQL Server, Core Cal, eCal, all those old Cal things you used to buy that you don't really need anymore because Microsoft 365 has superseded them. Those all went on the enterprise agreement as well. Now, the main way it works, you sign an enterprise agreement and you're committed and pay for 12 months of subscription effectively up front. And then there's some different ways to handle that as well. And then usually on your anniversary, so a year later, you have the option to adjust some of your quantities unless you have given up the contractual right to do that. And then after 3 years, you negotiate a new enterprise or new enrollment. See, I almost tripped over it myself. You negotiate a new enrollment to start after 3 years. And that usually includes some new mix of products, maybe some upgrades to products, so on and so forth. So the difference between the EA and the EAS is on the anniversary for an enterprise agreement subscription, it's almost like a renewal in that you do an annual order and you order everything from scratch. You kind of start from zero and say, what do we want for this year? So it's more flexible, but it's also more work. Now, finally, Andy also teased something called an MCA, or really, if you want the full name, the MCAE. It's the Microsoft Customer Agreement for Enterprise. And this is kind of the new way of buying things from Microsoft moving forward. Now, for most customers, their familiarity with it will be something called a MAC, a Microsoft Azure Commitment to Consume, MACC, is usually the first thing they put on an MCA. And also, if you've negotiated any agreements on specific services in Azure, those today go on an MCAE as well. So you'll start to run into MCAE more as time goes on, although it's still a new thing and still used in mostly limited cases. The enterprise agreement is still king. We are still negotiating new enrollment renewals as of right now. As I have customers coming up for renewal, we will do a new enrollment for them on their enterprise agreement or their enterprise agreement subscription. So EA is not dead, not going away, but the MCAE you will see more of with time. Now, one other note that I just saw before we went on the air within the last day or two, Microsoft has announced that the volume licensing levels for subscription online services will effectively collapse into a single licensing model moving forward, effective November 1st. So let's unpack what this means. Traditionally, if you think of Microsoft as a company that sold very high margin software licenses to customers to run on their own premises, there were greater discounts given out the more you bought. It was called volume licensing, right? And so if you bought more SQL Server licenses, more CALs, more SharePoint Server, more Exchange Server, you generally got better pricing programmatically. It was built in. The larger your organization was, the more it spent, the more you saved. That is still true for on-premises products. Where this is changing is for cloud products, where there used to be level A, B, C, D. That is going away, and everyone will get level A pricing, and then they're free to negotiate from there. Almost every customer negotiates their Microsoft licensing in some way, shape, or form. I fully expect that to continue. So all this really changes is some pretty minor variation as to the starting point for negotiations, but it doesn't at all affect where they wind up or what will happen with them. And generally, organizations that have the ability to commit more to Microsoft will see greater discounts in return. It's pretty standard business process. So if you hear about that, it is not the sky falling. It's not cause to jump off a cliff. You probably have negotiated pricing anyways. You haven't been buying straight list pricing ever as a Microsoft customer, and it really doesn't affect that. It's more of a simplicity thing. And the fact is, you don't have really economies of scale of, oh, I sold you 5,000 seats of Exchange as opposed to 3,000, versus with software I do, because all my costs are in the cost of selling it to you. But in online services, each incremental license has its own cost of goods sold. There's cost to run the servers, there's cost to maintain the service, and that does scale linearly with the numbers sold. So if you think of Microsoft's perspective, there's not really benefit to selling more at a lower cost. So anyhow, it's coming, just as an awareness piece on that. It is not the end of the world. Your procurement team will continue to negotiate fabulous pricing as all of them do, and that will continue. So I'm going to pause there. We touched on the enterprise agreement. We talked about how the enterprise agreement is actually evergreen, and it's the enrollments that expire, generally 3 years. We renew those every 3. On your anniversaries is your opportunity to make adjustments to that agreement. It also locks in pricing for that time. So when you negotiate pricing up front, you have price consistency for the next 3 years. And we talked about how the Microsoft Customer Agreement for Enterprise, the MCAE, is the agreement of the future. It's much simpler. It is also evergreen, and you will see more of it moving forward, initially for those Azure commitments to consume, and also any negotiated service level discounts in Azure services. So, Andy, did I miss anything there before we move on?
Yeah, one question that I'm going to ask you, because I know that a lot of listeners might have the same question, is what if I'm a small company? What constitutes moving to an EA? Because if I'm at a smaller company, you may not have the volume to even be on an EA or an EAS or an MCA. So how do smaller companies buy things? Because you mentioned LSP, and maybe even the very, very small companies might not even buy through an MSP. They may just go, and click on the button and buy a couple licenses. Right? So
sure. Yeah, there are other channels, like we have Web Direct, where you can buy direct on the web. One that's popular with smaller organizations is what's called CSP, or a cloud solutions provider. And that's effectively where, as opposed to paying Microsoft or an LSP, a licensing solutions provider, you're instead paying a cloud solution provider directly for your service. And they provide both the service as well as the support. It's all in one neat, tidy little package. And so an example might be like an Ingram Micro. They will sell you Microsoft 365 plus support all in one price. And that's really kind of turnkey solution for smaller organizations that may not have the procurement team it takes, or they perceive to take, to manage an enterprise agreement. I don't know what the minimum bar to entry is to sign an enterprise agreement. I also do know the MCA is going to be more broad reaching. That will scale from small, medium, commercial, all the way up to enterprise as well. That's the intent, is that's going to be kind of an all-encompassing agreement covering the different flavors we've had, because we've had a whole bunch of different licensing models that I'm frankly not familiar with for small, medium businesses that are effectively deprecated and will be replaced by the MCA at some point in the future as well. I am not an expert on that stuff, so don't take anything I just said as gospel, but just having a conversation about it. There are different ways to solve for it, whether that's buying direct on the web, whether that's, hey, you can still get an EA. You don't have to be that big to get one. I have a customer right now who's like 600 seats. They have an EA. So you do not have to be an enormous multinational to have one. And then, yeah, we'll continue to kind of expand the offerings there over time and bring the Microsoft customer agreement to more customers. And then CSP is a great solution as well, where you're buying through effectively a reseller, and it's kind of an all-in-one package. And you still get the same Microsoft 365 services. You just get your support all built in. You have one throat to choke, which is pretty nice, especially if you're a small, medium business. So there's some good options out there.
All right. So now let's get into the meat of the show here. So we're going to start with Office 365 because that's generally where most organizations start. So like as you're looking at licensing, you're like, okay, where do we start in the cloud? Office 365 E1 is basically the productivity stuff. You also get Entra as an identity provider for free. There's a free tier of Entra, which includes, basic identity sign-on, as well as you get SSO, so single sign-on into federated applications for cloud apps. You get MFA, but it's kind of that old school MFA where you just turn it on and you're prompted every single time you sign into Entra.
Actually, there is another option there too, Andy. So you can accept the security defaults in Entra, which is available to anyone, regardless of licensing level. And security defaults will enforce risk-based multi-factor authentication. You have no control or configuration over it. But if you don't want that prompt every time experience, which is also a choice you can have, the other choice is accept the predefined risk-based controls that are built into security defaults, and you will get it that way too.
Nice. Thanks for mentioning that. When most companies are like in this area, like you're just using Office 365, they'll often, be buying their machines with Windows Pro. The licensing is often included for Windows Pro when you purchase that license. And, Windows Pro has like Windows Hello for Business and some other things like BitLocker that's included. So that's usually where most companies are at that model. But you put here that this E1 licensing is getting deprecated. You want to talk a little bit more about that, or?
Yeah. So as Andy is mentioning here, and we'll pull this apart in just a second because he's landing a really critical concept with Office 365. So we're specifically saying Office 365 and not Microsoft 365. Those are two different things. Office 365 comes in F flavors, E flavors. E1 specifically is being deprecated. E3 is not. So there are some nuances between them in terms of mailbox size. If you have access to the Office applications on the web versus the installable executables on your Mac or PC. There is some nuance between the two, but E1 is actually going away in the near future. In fact, I think it's already to the point where, and here we're going to reference what we just talked about. If you don't have OE1 on your existing enrollment, you cannot add it to a new enrollment on your enterprise agreement already. I think it's only available for existing customers. Existing customers can continue to have it for now. It's deprecated and new customers cannot add more to their agreement. So yeah, that's going away. And then as long as we're on the subject, I'll just pull this part the rest of the way, Andy, because it's great lead into our next segment. When we talk about Office 365 versus Microsoft 365, what's the difference? So Microsoft 365, today, these concept is more or less gone away. But when it was originally created in summer of 2017, and I remember this because the previous name, just fun fact, I'll throw this out there, was the Secure Productive Enterprise, or SPE, SPE, before it was renamed Microsoft 365. We thought of that as three legs of a stool. There was Office 365, which is your core productivity platform, Exchange Online, SharePoint Online, and Teams, and OneDrive, and the Office apps, of course. And then there was Windows Enterprise, so the enhanced step up to enterprise for all of your devices. And it was the enterprise mobility and security suite, which at the time was things like Intune, Azure Information Protection, Azure Active Directory. I'm using the old names on purpose, Microsoft Cloud App Security, stuff like that, which has evolved over time. So those concepts as individual products still exist and you can still buy them. However, in practice, once you're ready to move from just core productivity with an Office 365, say E1, E3 SKU, you move to Microsoft 365, and you don't really get concerned about what was in those previous three legs of the stool. Those lines have really become blurry and they're really not relevant today. But it's helpful to know that's the historical context because you will still see references to that. Say in your admin portal, in the Microsoft 365 Admin Center, you may still see references to like EMS E5, and you're like, what the heck is that? It's a component of M365 E5. So Microsoft 365 is a bundle of bundles, which at Microsoft, we love our bundles, we love our suites. And so that's the best way I can think of to encapsulate it. And so I don't think it's terribly important to really pull those back apart, but just as awareness and as we go through, we'll use that to kind of steer the conversation today and help you kind of have a sense of place since we're describing something complicated. And technically you can still buy them standalone, but nobody should. And in the most part, nobody does. So
yeah, the historical context is still a lot of how I think of it and kind of separated in my mind. But like you mentioned, the next big bundle is M365. And so that's where a lot of enterprise companies, like once they move to an EA, that's generally the next step from just being an office person, just using the productivity to this E3 model. And what's included in that? You mentioned Windows Enterprise. And so Windows Enterprise is a huge step up from, Windows Pro. There's all the Windows Defender solutions that are included with that. You also get MDE-P1. So this is kind of that historical context because there used to be a Windows E5, which was Defender ATP, but now we have MDE. So Defender.
This is just a celebration of old product names today, man. We're going after it.
So MDE-P1 is essentially that AV solution. You get the rules for Defender on Windows, and it's really meant for it's user-based licensing. It's for your endpoints. And we will touch on servers at the end, but everything that we're talking about right now is all user-based licensing. So you license per user. And so you get Windows Enterprise, MDE-P1, and then you get your Office suite, the Office
before we move on from Windows, as long as we're doing licensing 101, I want to teach some folks something I didn't know and kind of felt like I should have. With Windows Enterprise is not a standalone SKU. It requires a qualifying underlying SKU to upgrade to it, and that is Windows Pro. So you do have to buy machines with Windows Pro, and then once you own Windows Enterprise with Windows 10 and later, you get an automatic step up. So the moment that user license has it applied, and if that user signed into that device, it'll automatically step up to Windows Enterprise. You don't have to do anything. It's kind of magical. You don't even have to re-image it. So with things like Windows Autopilot, you can go buy a PC, have it show up shrink wrapped, unwrap it, sign in, and it will do that step up from Windows Pro to Windows Enterprise automatically at the time of initial configuration during the out-of-box experience, the UBI process. It's really slick, but you do have to have Windows Pro to be eligible to go to Windows Enterprise. So you can't go buy a $300 laptop from Office Max and move it all the way to Windows Enterprise. You need to have a Windows Pro license first to be able to do that. So that's a nuance I didn't know until I'm embarrassed to admit later than I would have liked to have learned it. So as long as we're doing licensing 101, that is the thing to be aware of as well, is you do need that Pro license to move to Enterprise.
Yeah, and fun fact, my first job at Microsoft a long time ago, where I met Adam, was actually a lot of it was talking about Windows Enterprise, the difference between Windows Pro and Windows Enterprise. And there is a lot. And I won't like deep dive into it, but like things like application control, like Defender application control, attack surface reduction rules. I talked about BitLocker already. Defender,
definitely more BitLocker management. Yeah.
Yeah. The Defender credential guard. You get lapse, you get long-term servicing channel. This is something that is kind of a small portion, but like there are different versions of Windows where you're not getting those feature updates all the time. So in industries that might need operating systems to be a lot more stable, like in the OT industry, critical infrastructure, where you're not getting those feature updates twice a year, you have the long-term servicing channel, which is much more similar to server versions where they don't release the features all the time. There's also like Windows Update for Business, Windows Hello for Business, and most importantly, you get virtualization rights with Windows Enterprise. So if you need to virtualize Windows, you get the right for that. So a lot there. That was like a full-time job for me to like back in the day when a lot of companies were still on Windows Pro and we were trying to sell Windows Enterprise. There's a lot that's included in that. So
it's all on M365 Maps. It's got all of the enterprise benefits are listed on there. So the site Andy plugged at the top of the show, M365 Maps by our buddy Aaron Dinage, great resource. And by the way, M365 Maps, we should have called this out earlier. Technically not an official Microsoft resource, even though it isn't Microsoft FTE that supports and maintains it. Technically not an official source. So if you ever do run into a conflict between documentation or something someone has provided you or an agreement, that always wins over M365 Maps. So consider it a really good resource. I've never found an error on it in all the years of using it, but technically speaking, if there's anything on there, it is not gospel on that site. And if there's a discrepancy, that site loses, just so we're clear. But incredible resource, and it's got all of this. And what I love about that site too, so everything Andy just rattled off, you're like, oh, CredGuard. Yeah, we need to deploy Credential Guard. Yes, you do. And if you want to learn more, if you're on M365 Maps, it's got the little buttons, effectively, the little squares for each feature. Each one of those is linked directly to the technical documentation, which is amazing. If you click on the CredGuard little button, it will take you to Microsoft Learn, and there's the technical documentation on what it is, what it does, and how to deploy it. So a great resource. Can't plug it enough. Love it.
Now, as we move into like Office and EMS, this is where the lines get kind of blurred because this is really not how we sell our stuff today, because it's all included and we don't really like sell these little kind of bundles of bundles anymore. But I will try to group them in a way that makes sense. So in the Office part, that's where you get Exchange and email and files, creation of files. And so with that, you get Exchange Online Protection for email. For email security, that's the basic one. And then a lot of the information protection, information retention, you get the manual versions of that. So there's a lot that's actually included in this E3 bundle. You have sensitivity labels, you have retention labels, you can encrypt your files, you get the compliance manager, you get content search, which is like if you need to search all of your SharePoints, all of your emails for a specific thing for compliance purposes, litigation hold, you get e-discovery on the standard flavor. So all of that is included in the E3 bundle, kind of under that category of Office.
One other thing we should mention too, recent development, Microsoft Teams is no longer bundled as part of new Microsoft 365 E3 agreements, enrollments moving forward. So if you are an existing customer and you have Teams bundled today and you want to keep it bundled, you can. Existing customers only. If you don't currently own E3 today, or if you want to unbundle Teams moving forward, that is now an option. You can pull that out and not have that on your just built into like your Office 365 E3 like it used to be, or your M365 E3. That is no longer a requirement. So if you're a Zoom shop, if you're a WebEx shop, no plans to move to Teams, don't want to use Teams, you use Slack, you can now take that cost out of your next enrollment moving forward. So that is a recent change and a recent development that is available to customers now. You do not have to, Teams is not automatically bundled. It's actually a separate SKU. There's a Teams Enterprise SKU now that can be added separately or not. And if you want to keep it all together and you like it and you use it and you want to keep doing it that way, you can as well. So we've got a great flexibility for customers moving forward.
That's an important concept too, because oftentimes we'll get asked by customers, why don't you include this? Why don't you include this? And the reason is this Teams example that you mentioned, Adam, is specifically a reason why a lot of things aren't included in certain things, because we were sued Microsoft was sued by the EU because Teams was included in this bundle and it was anti-competitive, or they claimed it was anti-competitive against, Zoom and,
Slack and all that.
WebEx, whatever. And so as part of that lawsuit, the agreement was to separate the bundle so that enterprises can choose. And so back in the day, like, endpoint protection is a perfect example of one, why we have all these other endpoint protections out there. And people ask, why don't you include this in basic Windows? It's because we will get sued by the CrowdStrikes of the world, by whoever, for being anti-competitive and including those in these licensing models. So how we pick and choose, a lot of that depends on how Microsoft tries to appease the laws,
the regulatory environment. Yeah.
For a lot of this anti-competitive behavior.
Yeah, I mean, I will say this. You've heard stories of my, again, I plugged the Acquired podcast, and they walk through all of the antitrust Microsoft went through and how devastating it was to the company. And our current president, Brad Smith, was Microsoft's chief legal counsel on that case. And when he came in to make his presentation for how he wanted to handle it, he threw up a single PowerPoint slide and it said, "It's time to make peace." His point was, it's time to settle. It's time to move on. This is a distraction. This is not helping anyone. And I will say, Brad Smith, first off, is my absolute favorite leader at Microsoft. If you've never heard him speak, he's a really inspiring, really humble, kind gentleman. He's one of my favorite speakers we have. I wish he'd run for office because I would vote for the guy tomorrow. He's amazing. But he brings with us this sense of, we're going to compete fairly. We are going to be on the up and up and in the good graces of governments and organizations around the world and their trusted technology partner. We mean that seriously. Like, this is not just, again, I'm not getting paid to say this, right? This is genuinely, like, our commitment today is we want to compete fairly. And yes, this is the big challenge with technology today, is that discussion on what can we integrate, what can we build in, and where do we need to leave room for competition. Everyone is facing this challenge right now. Google and Apple are knee deep in fights with governments around the world on this exact concept of what is fair bundling versus unfair bundling. The whole concept of, is Chrome even a viable business if it's not tied to driving Google search? I would argue it's not. Chrome is no value without Google. Apple does a great job of making stuff just work together. They deliver a great user experience. But at the same time, other solutions can't come in and integrate as well. What is fair versus unfair about that? This is a big conversation in technology, and it is not limited to Microsoft. And so, to Andy's point, we are thoughtful about baking in as much value as we can and continuing to iterate and develop and bring more to the table in all of these solutions over time. They do get better with time. There are more features than they used to have, but also cognizant of the fact that it can be unfair to competitors if we bake something in for free or at no additional cost that they're outselling. Apple has done this for years. People have a name for it. They call it Sherlocking. All the way back when Apple built into Mac OS 9 a search functionality that completely replicated a third-party software product called Sherlock. And ever since, as Apple has literally put small independent software vendors out of business by just baking stuff into their platform, they just go, oh, they got Sherlocked, and they laugh off, but it's someone's livelihood whenever you bake something in. And so we're very cognizant of that. I'd say maybe the most cognizant and cautious about it. And even when we think we're doing right, like Teams for the most part is a front end to SharePoint. It's a front end to OneDrive, and it's a front end to M365 groups, which are effectively an Exchange. It's just a front end UI to all that stuff for the most part, but the regulators didn't see it the same way. And so we made peace, as Brad Smith encourages us to do. So Andy, you're right. We get asked that question all the time. And I'm trying to kind of help unpack and help our listeners understand why those are not always easy decisions. Everyone from an economic perspective wants more value at no additional cost. Of course, that's the number one thing we're all in search of. But is that fair in an open market? Generally, no. And so how do you balance those conflicting needs? And that's a hard problem to solve. and it's way above my pay grade and yours. But it's something we're really cognizant about and really committed to competing fairly, even when it's hard. Believe me, as a security seller, I wish we'd bake more stuff in. It'd make my life a lot easier if I had to go sell stuff that I could say, hey, we could take out this, that, and this, and your cost is, X, and you're spending 3X over here. I can still say that with E5, but I mean, they could make that even more of a no-brainer if they really wanted to, I guess is my point. So anywho, it's a good conversation to have, and it's bigger than Microsoft. It's technology as a whole. And I will say, as a consumer, I generally like it when stuff is bundled, baked in, integrated, but I understand the challenges with that model too. And I have felt that difficulty sometimes where I like a lot of what Apple does and I use a lot of their ecosystem, but there are times when it's like, gosh, I wish I could plug something else in here seamlessly. And it's frustrating that it's not as good of a solution as the built-in one. I wish there was a way that I could set like a default photo library. All my photos that I take go into another photo app like Google Photos or something, and not be just absolutely handcuffed to iCloud Photo Library. iCloud Photo Library is a good experience from the automatic sync and integration and all that, but Apple's photo management is really poor. And I wish I had a better solution there. So it's like, well, I'm stuck because it's the only thing that's built in and integrated. It's not an open format. And then you get the argument that could it be as good if it were an open API that any app could plug into? I don't know the answer to that, but so far Apple has not shown a lot of interest in doing that, and so we could talk about this all day, but it's a really good discussion. And it's really interesting. And I'm just kind of sharing our thoughts on that, and how we approach it. And certainly competition, as I always say on this show, is the rising tide that lifts all ships anyway. So I think competition generally is a really good thing.
All right. So that third leg of that stool is EMS, or enterprise mobility and security. And this is really where a lot of the security features initially were all part of. So, which is funny because as part of EMS licensing, you do get the server cows and the core cows included. And so that's a lot of reasons why a lot of companies moved to the E3 model, because it was simpler. It included everything that they needed, and it was cheaper than buying each one of these things separately. And so you get your core cows, you get config manager, a lot of the things that companies were using that were licensed separately. You also get Entra P1, which is the first paid portion of the identity portion. So you get conditional access, cloud app discovery, all the cool things in Entra P1, like password protection, passwordless authentication, self-service password reset. And there's quite a bit there. And that's really like, if you think of it like in a competitor's mindset, like an Okta or a Ping, it's like first tier, like the first paid tier of Okta. If you were to go out, because Okta has multiple tiers as well, right? And so if you go out and get the basic tier for Okta, get the basic tier for Ping, this is basically what it is. It's kind of an apples to apples-ish comparison. You also get Intune Plan 1, which is a lot included there. You get device management for all the different operating systems. You get application management. So a full MDM solution, which of course you can buy. Again, you can buy this stuff separately, right? Intune P1, Entra P1, but a full MDM management. You get autopilot as part of that. Yeah. And then again, information protection. So the manual labeling, sensitivity labels, all of that. So the EMS suite, or, that portion of that leg, included a lot of everything that companies needed to get started on security. So in the E3 model, kind of to sum it up, you get that basic endpoint protection, Defender AV, the Defender for Endpoint Plan 1. You get MDM, you get Entra, you get Office, as well as a bunch of the purview things on the manual side of it, like manual labeling for sensitivity, manual labeling for retention, that content search, so on, and Exchange Online protection. And so that's the core of the E3 model. And when you're ready, then you move on to the E5 stuff, which we'll get into. Adam, you have some thoughts?
Just to summarize what you kind of laid out there. So Microsoft 365 E3, it's your core productivity, core identity, core device management platform, where you're going to have email in the cloud, Exchange Online, document collaboration in the cloud, SharePoint Online, OneDrive for business. You're going to get everything you need to have basic protection of those files in the cloud as far as data loss prevention, basic data loss prevention, basic information protection, sensitivity labeling, basic retention policies, deleting stuff you don't need, retaining stuff you do need, be able to do content searches and litigation holds and e-discovery, manage the identity, set the policies in which an identity can and cannot access the platform, manage the devices accessing the platform, whether that's Mac OS, iOS, iPad OS, TV OS, Android, Windows 10 and 11, all supported out of the box with your ME3, Microsoft 365 E3 license. So there's a ton of value here. Oh, I forgot the Windows Enterprise, the Defender for Endpoint Plan 1. So your core antivirus and malware protection on all of your endpoints. And by the way, Defender for Endpoint Plan 1 also Windows, Mac OS, iOS, iPad OS, Android, supported across all major platforms. So you can protect them, you can manage them, you can manage the identities, you have all the core collaboration capabilities all built right in. You're ready for Teams if you want to add Teams Enterprise to it, or if you have renewed your existing Teams bundling, you have then Teams as well, which is your collaboration and productivity platform, and really the OS for business, if you will. With all the applications and everything else supported there. So there's a ton of value there. And many organizations have now finally, after many years of this being available, I remember I did my first migration from Lotus Notes to this in 2013. So it's been 12 years now, hard to believe. Organizations are pretty mature on this platform. They're getting a ton of value out of it. I mean, Intune is larger than all the other MDM providers combined at this point. Most mobile devices in the world are managed with Intune today. Entra ID is far and away the largest enterprise identity management platform in the world today. Dwarfs Okta and Ping put together in terms of core capability and also not core capability, but core number of users, monthly active users. So it's a really mature, really robust platform, and customers have gotten a ton of value out of it. And so just as an awareness piece, like the price of this went up like 3 years ago in 2022, and it was the first price increase on it in a decade. And I can tell you, as somebody who was there in the early days, in the front lines in IT deploying this stuff, the amount of innovation that happened on this platform in a decade was staggering. So much got added to it over time. And that was a fair, modest, I think, price increase given the overall inflationary environment, just to get the value of all the innovation that have been baked into it. So a lot of organizations now, and I will say, in my experience, we're at 85% of them in the enterprise, probably roughly or so, have now taken that next step and moved to Microsoft 365. Because to be fair, we have certainly incented that move through attractive pricing and attractive offers as they've done their enrollment renewals on their enterprise agreement, but also they've maxed out the value of E3 and they're looking to max out even more value and extend that platform further. And how can they take all the economies of scale and the integration they get and realize even more benefit from it? And that's why many of them, most of them at this point, have looked at and have moved to Microsoft 365 E5. So let's unpack what's E5 all about, Andy.
Yeah. E5 is where you get a lot of that advanced security, right? And so when you're looking at advanced email security, and not just email, because Defender for Office includes all the Office applications, including Teams. And so if you're looking, but many people start with email. So like if you're looking at a Mimecast, you're looking at a Proofpoint, in E5 you get that Defender for Office. And again, a lot of the stuff you can buy separately, but included in E5 is an advanced email security gateway, as well as protection on the API level for your Office applications. For Windows, you get Defender for Endpoint P2, and that is where you get your advanced EDR solution, your XDR solution. You get the automated investigations, the attack path, exposure management, all of that stuff is included with the Defender for Endpoint P2. There's also Defender Vulnerability Management Core that's included. We're not going to do a deep dive because there is a advanced SKU for that as well, but Defender Vulnerability Management. So anything that's onboarded with Defender for Endpoint will get you that continuous monitoring, device inventory, remediation tracking. your software inventory, vulnerability assessments for the applications that are installed, as well as the operating system. So kind of like a basic Nessus, like if you already own Nessus and you are looking to reduce licensing for that, you have this built in for anything that is able to be onboarded with Defender for Endpoint, as well as network scanning. So you can do network scanning of certain firewalls and all that. So that's all included. EMS E5, quote unquote E5 portion of that would include Entra P2. Entra P2 has a lot included with it, including risk-based conditional access, privileged identity management, that just-in-time escalation,
elevation,
of privileges, as well as some governance things that are included. So access reviews and entitlement management, which is essentially like looking at, let's say, a good example for access reviews is like, all the guest users in my environment. Let's do a review of that. Or it could be a specific M365 group that has privileged rights. So you can do a review of that. And entitlement management is being able to grant access to certain resources, or you can even use it to escalate to certain roles if you want to. So a lot included in there. Defender for Identity is another big one. And that is the on-premise identity protection solution. So that's included in the E5. Defender for Cloud Apps, which is the CASB for Microsoft, full-on CASB solution that's included in E5. So you get, Cloud App Discovery, which is part of that. That's in the E3. But then you have enforcement. So if you see a cloud app that you don't want to be sanctioned in your organization, you can block it. There's also a lot of information protection features that are integrated into the CASB. There's a forward proxy that's included in that. So if you want to do session controls for cloud apps, that's included in the E5 portion. And then when it comes to the purview stuff, full purview suite in E5, right? DLP for Teams, endpoint DLP is included in the E5 portion. Insider risk management, whole insider risk management suite. Communications compliance, automatic labeling. So if you want like automatic rules-based labeling for encryption, for sensitivity, for retention, sensitive labels based on advanced classifiers like trainable classifiers, contextual named entities, that's all included. E-discovery premium and audit premium. And so, we can break all this stuff down, and we have in previous shows. So we're not going to do a whole deep dive into like the specific capabilities, but in the E5 portion, that's where a lot of the advanced security, advanced compliance that a lot of people go out and buy like a point solution for. In the E3 version, I would say the point solutions that you can probably get rid of is any individual MDM, that you're already buying, and any individual identity provider that you're buying. But in the now you're looking at that advanced EDR solution, the advanced security, email security gateways, on-premise identity protection, and then a lot of the purview, the compliance, data security, data retention, those sorts of things are all included in the E5. So anything I missed there that you want to mention, Adam?
Not really. I think your very last point kind of summarized it well in terms of when customers look at these platforms, generally it is with an eye toward what kind of consolidation can I do? And if you're listening to this show, you probably at least have a moderate to positive impression of Microsoft security. Otherwise, Andy and I would drive you nuts, unless you just listen to the show, just to hate on everything we're saying, which maybe, if that's your thing, good for you. But I would imagine most Microsoft haters do not listen to the show because they couldn't stand it. That said, most of the tools in this E5 platform are best in class. So oftentimes there's presented that this dichotomy of you either need to choose best of breed individual solutions and then stitch them all together yourself, or you can choose a platform, although each of the solutions is not as good. But if you go look at the Magic Quadrants, the Forrester Waves, the IDC Marketscapes, the KuppingerCole Leadership Compasses from all these different IT analysts, they consistently rank most of these tools at the head of their class, literally number one or number two in almost every axis, almost every category in which they compete. So this perception that you have to choose one or the other, I think is a false dichotomy, because you can actually get both with this platform. And yes, you know darn well who signs my paychecks, but facts are facts. I mean, you can't fake an MQ. You can't fake a Forrester Wave. They will trash you if they feel like it. And believe me, we've been on the blunt end of some bad MQs and waves over the years. We've had a couple of ones come out where it's like, gosh, how did we fall down so far? But lately, firing in all cylinders. And even with ones that have been criticized in the past. So I'll take, for example, Defender for Office. Andy mentioned secure email gateway, but way more, because also protection for everything in Teams, SharePoint, OneDrive, and the Office application. So much more holistic protection. You can certainly use it as a second pass of protection with your existing secure email gateway. Say you can have Proofpoint look at it first, and then we can take a second pass. That's fine. Or some organizations like to pair it with an API-based post-delivery protection solution like Abnormal. Andy and I, we will call a spade around here. And let's be fair. MDO is, I just mentioned all these products going really well and waves and quadrants and all that. This product has not particularly performed well in the past. The perception has been, it is not industry leading. It is not class leading. It's pretty good, but it's not up to par with some of the others. In our product group, they felt that, to kind of borrow the lingo of the youths today. And they have been heads down working on this with a fever pitch. And they have come back and really pounded their chest and said, you know what? You're right. We weren't there, but we put in the work, we put in the time, and we think today we are absolutely best in class. They partnered with the folks at SE Labs to do some benchmarking and blew away the competition and posted a blog post about this. And we will share it in the show notes. You can make your own evaluation, right? But if you're looking for some data, we just recently published a blog post in the past couple of weeks where we are now claiming to be absolute best in class in the industry from an efficacy perspective with Defender for Office as a secure email gateway. So very interesting data point, because this team has by no means had any right to make that claim before and has not made that claim before because they knew they had no right to make it. So this is a sea change from them. This is a change in their communication. The other thing they pointed out is a lot of these post-delivery API protection solutions like Abnormal deliver very marginal incremental value. So for Abnormal, it was of a percentage point of additional catch above and beyond MDO. And I guarantee you, they're not doing it for free. They're looking for a pretty hefty check. So what you have to ask yourself is whatever they're asking, is it worth 0.3% more catch than what I get with Defender for Office today or not? A lot of their catch they claim is stuff that MDO actually caught. So they do a little bit of funny math with this too. And we mentioned that in this blog post as well. So you can review that. Some great material there, but we'll just say some of these products have been best in class for years. Defender for Endpoint, look at any Forrester Wave Magic Quadrant, it's CrowdStrike and Microsoft. On every single one of them, we're the top two. You look at Entra ID, absolutely top of its class, right there, usually ahead of Okta and Ping, but in the conversation for number one or number two in every category. So many of these are identity threat detection response, the combination of Defender for Identity and Entra ID protection. Those two solutions together cover both your cloud and on-premises identities. Again, Kuppinger-Cole, top of the leadership quadrant, best in class in what it does. So you can replace your existing solutions with really strong, very high efficacy solutions from Microsoft. And that's what a lot of organizations are doing. That's why we see in the enterprise now E5 adoption. And I'm just going on what I know, so don't take this as like gospel or anything, but it's over 2/3. It's the majority of organizations have moved to E5, and it's because they are going through this effort to rationalize their platform and move as much to an integrated platform as possible. That's the value they see. And finally, I'm just going to hit this one, Andy, since I can break this down real quick. You've kind of mentioned, as have I throughout the show, that you can buy everything standalone. And for most part, all the security solutions we just named, that's true. You can buy just Defender for Endpoint, Plan 2. You can buy just Defender for Office, Plan 2. You can buy just Defender for Identity. With the compliance platform, it's slightly different. And it's because a lot of the solutions in that space have interdependencies on each other. So for example, our data loss prevention platform is not terribly useful if you're not also putting sensitivity labels on your files. You can use it without doing it, but it gets a lot better when you do. And so we realized there are really kind of some minimum packaging requirements that make sense in the compliance space. So although you can't get down to the individual product level, we get close. We have what we call mini SKUs that break down. We have one, information protection and governance. We have one that's e-discovery and audit. And we have one that's insider risk management. And each one of those is a small collection of solutions, then a very targeted use case and a very targeted scope. But because they have those interdependencies, that's the minimum packaging for those. So that's kind of the one exception to the rule of everything can be bought standalone, not quite in the compliance space. And then as you kind of roll up, if you don't want full E5, but maybe you want all the security E5, there is a security E5 bundle. And if you want all the, we used to kind of call it compliance, we're more saying data security, but we'll answer to either one of them. Compliance E5 bundle does exist as well. So you can buy those standalone bundles instead of the whole full E5. Although I will say, depending on how your negotiations go with Microsoft, generally the best pricing is going to be on the full E5 suite. Just there tends to be more opportunity to negotiate on that. So your mileage may vary, your negotiations may vary, but that's what you may see.
And the reason why some companies go with that is because, we haven't talked about it, but you get a lot of productivity stuff with the full E5, like Teams conferencing, Power BI licensing, so on and so forth. So for whatever reason, if you're like, I don't want that, we do have those, step downs of like E5 security specifically or E5 compliance specifically, and then even further, like Adam said, in those compliance mini SKUs. So a lot there, but anyways, just know that you have options. And then finally, I wanted to talk about server security because as all of the things that we talked about here so far, they're all licensed per user. It's all a user license per user per month. Server security kind of is outside of that. And so for server security, there is MDE for servers, which is the kind of the old model, but like if you needed it and you want to just license MDE per server, that's still available. And there is actually technically also an MDE per like device as well. Like if it's not a shared device, there's specific use cases where like maybe you don't know the user that's going to be logging in, so on and so forth. It's a kiosk and a public kiosk and you just want a license. You can do it per device as well. It's still available. And I added to your EA if you need to do it. And so those are line items billed per specific device, number of devices that's just added on. But the newer version of that is for servers, Defender for Servers P1 and P2, which is an Azure subscription. It is a consumption based. And the beauty of it is the difference between the MDE for servers and Defender for Servers is, let's say you have 300 servers and you tag on 300 servers onto your EA. But let's say you have 50 of them that are old, and you decommission them. Well, that EA, that enrollment is through the 3 years, and you're still going to be paying for those servers, on that EA. Whereas Defender for Servers, it's a consumption base. And so it's Azure based. You can extend it to on-prem via Arc, so on and so forth. So if you decommission servers, or let's say you spin down servers at the end of the night and they're not in use and you spin them back up, you're only paying for that use that server is active. So it's a lot more friendly to the billing model versus just tagging on the number of devices that you're going to pay for.
Right. Absolutely. Yes. Because Defender for Servers is billed hourly as opposed to, to give a final example here, if you want to add something to your enterprise agreement enrollment, at your anniversary, you would pay for 12 months upfront. So you need to cut a check for 12 months. So let's say you have 1,000 servers, $5 per server, times 12 months. I'm bad at math here, but it's like what, $60,000, something like that. I don't know. You cut a check right then and there. And then to Andy's point, let's say 6 months later, you spun down those servers. You have those licenses till your next anniversary, at which point you could reduce the quantity for the next year, but you are stuck with it till then. There's a little less flexibility there versus with the Azure model. You would only pay for the hours any one of those servers are running. You spin it down, you stop paying within the hour. It's much more granular. Also, if you think about how your procurement works, they have to go through a whole process, get a PO, cut a PO, do this, do that. You probably don't even know when the licenses are in your tenant right away. And so there's that gap of time between when they finally show up and when you can start deploying them. And I'd be willing to bet you're not going to deploy it to all your servers on day one unless you're named CrowdStrike. So it's one of those things where you have that gap in deployment time before you can even recognize the value as well. With the other model, again, until it's turned on and delivering value, you're not paying for it. So much more flexible model. Also, there are 2 flavors. Andy mentioned a P1 and P2. P1 is effectively priced the same as the license, like the old school EA model. So there's no cost differential there. Plan 2 gets you a whole bunch of additional capabilities, which, since we're over an hour on the show already, we won't unpack, but we will link in the show notes and you can see what the difference is there. The full vulnerability management suite, amongst many other really cool and useful capabilities as well. So we strongly encourage you to use the Azure subscription-based model, Defender for Servers. Just Andy mentioned this, but I will reiterate it, not just for stuff in Azure. Just so we're clear, you can use it with stuff deployed on premises in AWS, in GCP, in OCI, in Alibaba, in any cloud you want. IBM Cloud, doesn't matter. If you can put the Azure Arc agent on it, you're good to go. And in fact, you don't even technically have to do that. You could do what's called direct onboarding and turn it on that way and do that as well. I had a customer deploy all of their devices that way, and they're getting billed just fine through their Azure subscription. So it's just where the billing comes through. It doesn't mean you're committed to only protecting stuff in Azure. Although protecting stuff in Azure is particularly easy because you flip a switch for that subscription and everything that subscription has control of is automatically enrolled and automatically protected. It's amazing. So definitely a very high ease of deployment for that solution. But as Andy mentioned, none of that is included with those M365 licenses. If you want to protect servers, that's a separate thing. And we will unpack more on protecting your servers, your cloud infrastructure, and all those sorts of PaaS and IaaS services in a part 2 or part 3 of this show.
All right. Well, it's pretty tough to get really detailed on Microsoft licensing in just an hour. So this was a very high level overview. Certainly, if you have questions, feel free to email us or, contact your Microsoft rep or your LSP or your CSP, and they can further break it down for you. But just know that there's quite a lot that's included in these suites. So our contact information, along with a lot of the links that we referenced, will be in the show notes. If you have any questions or comments, let us know. Or if you have topics you want us to talk about in the future, they might make it onto the show, just like today. So just email us. Thanks, and we'll talk to you guys next week.
Thank you for listening to the Blue Security Podcast. Please check out the show notes, catch up on episodes you may have missed, and subscribe so you don't miss any future episodes. Find Andy on Twitter @AJaw0 and Adam @AJ Brewer. See you at our next episode.